In the year 1985, the routine of a quiet American suburb was literally torn to pieces when the silence of a Sunday morning in the state of Virginia was replaced by the sharp screech of braking black government sedans. The residents of Smithfield, accustomed to seeing in John Anthony Walker only a retired United States Navy officer and the owner of a modest private detective agency, could not comprehend the magnitude of what was happening as they watched their neighbor being led away in handcuffs. According to declassified data, this operation was the culmination of the longest and most damaging espionage activity in the history of the Western defense industrial complex. What began as a financial gamble of a desperate man turned into a systemic betrayal lasting 17 years and drawing an entire family into its orbit, making them unwitting or conscious accomplices in the greatest theft of secrets of the 20th century. According to declassified data from the Committee for State Security, John Anthony Walker was not initially a product of a classical Soviet intelligence school, yet his recruitment and subsequent training turned him into an ideal instrument. In the late 60s, when he first entered the embassy of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in Washington, his motive was money. But the professionals from Soviet intelligence quickly realized that, for long-term work, he required serious psychological and technical preparation. Investigators later established that Walker underwent specific adaptation courses that instilled in his mind the methods of work used by professional illegal intelligence officers. Particular attention in his training was paid to the psychology of cover and survival methods under constant surveillance by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. One of the key exercises that his handlers from the Committee for State Security forced him to practice during rare overseas meetings was called the method of emotional dissociation. Instructors taught him to create two isolated personalities within himself: an exemplary family man and a cold intelligence operative. He was given the task of talking about his children with sincere warmth for an hour, and then, on command, instantly switching to a dry report on the technical characteristics of encryption machines without allowing the slightest change in his pulse or tone of voice. This allowed him to look into the eyes of his wife and children for years while hiding behind the mask of a loving father, the calculated agent who had long since sold their safety. The second important lesson was the art of working with dead zones and dead drops. Walker was trained to notice microscopic changes in the urban landscape that could serve as signals. An instructor led him along a specially prepared route where markers were hidden among piles of trash or old advertisements. Walker had to identify the necessary brick or branch where a container was hidden while on the move without slowing his pace or turning his head. He was taught that any delay of more than 3 seconds was a failure and a signal to immediately abort the mission. This skill of being unremarkable in the best sense of the word became his main weapon in the conditions of living in the United States of America. John Walker's life in the suburbs was a masterpiece of camouflage where boring routine served as armor against the suspicions of counterintelligence. The first element of his daily life that strengthened his legend was his active participation in the affairs of the local parish and volunteering in a United States Navy veterans organization. He regularly gave patriotic speeches, criticizing the lack of discipline in youth and emphasizing the importance of the oath. The second element was his emphasized commitment to family traditions. Every Saturday he hosted barbecues for neighbors, discussing gasoline prices and baseball scores, creating an image of an absolutely predictable and understandable person. The third element was his work as a private detective after retiring from the Navy. This allowed him to justify strange working hours, frequent absences, and the possession of special photographic equipment that was actually used to photograph secret documents of the Department of Defense. However, behind this facade lay a monstrous tension. Investigators later established the details of one evening when his wife, Barbara, already suspicious, tried to draw him into a frank conversation. That evening, in their living room, lit only by the dim light of a floor lamp, Barbara asked him why he had become so detached and where all their savings were going if he worked so hard. John, looking at her, felt for a moment the wall between his personalities crack. He understood that every word of his could be either salvation or the end. He approached her, took her hands, and said that he was doing all this for their future, so that their children would never know the want in which he himself grew up. It was a half-truth, the most dangerous kind of lie. Sincere bitterness sounded in his voice, but it was the bitterness of a man who realizes that his love has long since become part of his cover. He saw the tears in her eyes and understood that he was imitating intimacy to preserve his secret, and this betrayal of feelings was for him more terrible than the transfer of encryption codes. The methods of gathering and transmitting information used by Walker were striking in their systematic nature. One of his largest operations began with careful preparation in his home office, where entry was forbidden to all family members. Using a Minox portable camera, he spent hours photographing pages of secret communication regulations for the Atlantic Region submarine fleet. He developed the film himself, turning negatives into microfilms, which he then hid in specially made canisters that looked like ordinary used batteries. The route to the transfer site was a complex loop through 3 states. He left his home in Virginia at 4 o'clock in the morning, constantly changing his driving pace and using the dry tail method to ensure there was no surveillance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He drove into public parking lots of shopping centers, entered one store, and exited through another, changing hats and jackets. The exact location of the dead drop was in a rural area of the state of Maryland, near an old telephone booth at the intersection of 2 inconspicuous roads. Under a layer of soil and broken brick at the base of the booth, he left a package disguised as a fast food bag. A few miles from this location, a short, so-called snap contact occurred with a handler diplomat from the Committee for State Security. It happened at a gas station where Walker stopped supposedly to buy a map. A man in a raincoat passed by him, barely brushing his shoulder. This was the signal. The handler uttered a code phrase about the weather being too dry for crops this year, to which Walker replied with a prearranged password about rain falling more often in Virginia than expected. At that moment, an exchange of glances occurred, which confirmed that the package was successfully placed, and the reward would be waiting for him in the next dead drop in 2 weeks. It was cold, mechanical work, devoid of romance, but it was precisely this work that provided the Soviet Union with information about the movement of every American nuclear submarine. However, the perfect mechanism failed. Investigators later established that the alarm was raised not by a technical error, but by a human factor. His former wife Barbara, unable to withstand the weight of suspicion and the moral decay of the family, informed the Federal Bureau of Investigation of her suspicions. In May 1985, Walker felt the ring closing in. During his last attempt to place a dead drop in a wooded area, he noticed strange lights in his rearview mirror. That night, in a motel room, he faced the most difficult choice of his life. Before him lay a map and forged documents prepared for an emergency. His inner monologue was a struggle between the remnants of humanity and the instinct for self-preservation. He thought of his son Michael, whom he himself had drawn into espionage, and who was now on board an aircraft carrier with a cargo of stolen secrets. He understood that if he fled now, he would condemn his children to shame and prison, making them the primary targets of justice. But the ideological duty, which had long since replaced his conscience, and the fear of life imprisonment screamed of the need to escape. He weighed on the scales his own life and the lives of those he called his family. The evacuation plan developed by the Committee for State Security was complex and multi-staged. He was supposed to abandon his car in a suburb of Washington, take a night bus to Philadelphia, using a passport in the name of a farmer from Ohio. From there, he was to get to Mexico City, where contact with tickets for a flight to Havana awaited him in a park. Only after a transfer in Cuba could he count on a safe flight to Moscow, where a pension of an honored Czechist and a faceless apartment in a high-rise building awaited him. He had already begun packing his things when he realized that leaving the room unnoticed was impossible. The tactical teams of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already blocked all exits. His choice was made for him by the circumstances he himself had created. The conclusion of this story leaves a heavy echo in the history of intelligence. The consequences of the activity of the Walker Group are assessed by specialists as catastrophic. The United States of America was forced to completely change the codes and communication methods of the entire Navy, which cost taxpayers billions of dollars. But the psychological price was even higher. His son Michael, brother Arthur, and devoted friend Jerry Whitworth all ended up behind bars because of the manipulations of a man they trusted. The family that was supposed to be his cover and support turned into ashes. The question that remains unanswered is what exactly won out in the soul of John Walker during those long 17 years. Was it duty to the service that gave him a sense of his own importance and superiority? Or was it the complete atrophy of human feelings under the pressure of the tradecraft of espionage? Could he have pulled the trigger, or betrayed his children once more if it guaranteed him freedom? The irony of fate is that the man who sought to secure the future of his family through betrayal ultimately became the one who destroyed that future forever. In the world of the great game, human relationships turned out to be merely a tool that, sooner or later, breaks under the weight of lies, leaving behind only a cold, analytical report in the archives of the intelligence services. Can the success of an intelligence officer be considered complete if the price of that success is total moral bankruptcy and the betrayal of everything that makes a person human? This story remains a reminder that in the conflict between ideology and family on the field of espionage, there are no winners, only victims and those who manage to go into the shadows in time, leaving behind the ruins of other people's lives.